It is one of the overlooked timelines of 1943, a period when the Allies, on paper, were finally beginning to turn the tide in the North Atlantic. Yet the U.S. Navy still bled quietly, ship by ship, in the open ocean. What many documentary viewers never realize is that mid-1943 was not victory cruise mode. Even after cracking Triton and many of the newer naval Enigma keys, convoys were still suffering abrupt losses in waters the Admiralty believed were momentarily low threat. And into that uneasy transitional period, the shift from Wolfpack dominance to Allied tactical pressure sails our case. The destroyer we will follow, USS Turner, DD-648, a Gleaves-class destroyer, was one of the class nicknamed knife fighters of the Atlantic, designed to slash ahead of convoy columns, radar out front, listening for the slightest Morse pulse from a surface Type 7. She had been commissioned only a year earlier, spring 1943, at Atlantic Basin Iron Works, New York. At 1,630 tons standard displacement, armed with dual-purpose 5-inch/38s, 40mm Bofors, 20mm Oerlikons, K-guns, and depth-charge tracks, she was fast enough to run down a surfaced U-boat at night, and agile enough to turn inside their torpedo arcs. The ship's officers came mostly from destroyer school at Newport. Many of its enlisted crew had cross-trained from merchant patrol, subchasers, or Atlantic escort groups. This was a hungry ship, a crew eager to prove their value at a time when the press was still headlining the submarine menace almost weekly. Convoy commanders in the period speak often of the psychological swing in 1943. One day, you felt like the hunter, the next day you were waiting for the hammer. You never believed the charts, one escort officer wrote in his diary, archived at the Naval History and Heritage Command. The grid maps were a fiction. The ocean had its own mind. That sentence could have been carved into the bulkhead of every CIC aboard a destroyer that summer. The Allies now had centimetric radar on many ships, SG radars, but storm clutter, sea return, and low-profile schnorkels could still turn the system into noise. And the Germans, for their part, were adjusting. The Wolfpacks of early 43, Seeschlenge, Sturmbach, Donau, and later Luthen, were no longer blindly charging mass convoys. They were shifting, setting more refined trap lines. It was cat and mouse, except both the cat and the mouse had teeth. Turner during this period operated in the New York, Newfoundland, Western Approaches shuttle lane, under task force escort duty attached to Atlantic Fleet destroyers, frequently assigned into convoy UGS and UGF movements going toward Gibraltar or the UK. These were fast convoys, troop carriers, valuable cargo, and in some cases, wore critical materials destined for bomber command. On paper, the ship's October schedule in 1943 looked ordinary enough. But there was a subtle tension building. Admiralty HF/DF, Huffduff, was showing gaps. There were not enough German radio transmissions for the positions they expected. As one Royal Navy RENS operator later testified, their silence was louder than their talking. When Wolfpacks go quiet, the escorts get nervous. On the afternoon before departure on October 9, 1943, Turner refueled and loaded replacement Hedgehog spigot charges, a newer contact bomb designed to explode only on impact with a submarine hull, not on timer fusing like older depth charges. The ship's engineering logs mention a brief inspection for venting after the reload, routine, but the detail is worth noting. Hedgehog racks were sensitive. That night, under radio discipline protocols, she was assigned screening station ahead, the forward spear point of the convoy formation. Her job, move out front, radar scanning, intercept before the convoy column was in torpedo range. When the destroyer pulled away from convoy center that night, weather overcast, low visibility, sea state moderate, winds force 3, the only people who noticed anything unusual were two signalmen who later said that the HF/DF silence in the sector felt wrong. One of them, unnamed in the surviving typed airboard post-action notes, wrote a chilling short remark: "They weren't talking back." This period, this escort profile, and this moment, is the hinge. It is here, in this seemingly routine tactical pattern, that the mystery begins to form. A destroyer that should have been the safest knife in the convoy box, one of the best sensors, one of the best hunters, is about to vanish into the Atlantic. Night on the mid-Atlantic in October 1943 was rarely benign. Even when the sea was technically calm, the darkness itself felt predatory. The escorts understood this intuitively. One Royal Canadian Navy officer later described it as the kind of black where you didn't see the horizon, you felt it. Convoy UGS-21 was eastbound and heavily loaded, not with bulk cargo, but with speed-rated transports that mattered. The destroyer USS Turner was ordered forward on a standard picket sweep alignment, a 3 to 5 mile radar uplift arc, out ahead of the convoy's prow. That meant one thing: she would be the first ship to touch the knife if a U-boat Wolfpack was maneuvering into position. The convoy commodore's night orders show the priority clearly: maintain speed, avoid tactical delay. The transports could not be risked in a search grid if contact was made. The escorts were the shield, and when the shield goes out front, the shield sometimes dies alone. Signals later reconstructed show that at exactly 2:42 Zulu, October 9, 1943, Turner briefly painted what the log described as a short-range intermittent surface contact. In plain language, a blip, not a track. It did not persist long enough to plot vector, speed, or bearing. And then, it vanished. This is not unusual in the Battle of the Atlantic context. Type 7 U-boats would often run just high enough on ballast to push their snorkel or conning tower above water for a few seconds, to update gyro or course alignment, then drop back into the dark. But what is unusual is that the radar officer, later interviewed for Area Combined Intelligence files, said the return had the amplitude of something larger than a snorkel. Almost like an object in partial shadow. Something with metal, but not fully surfaced. Under convoy doctrine, that brief contact should have triggered one of two tactical reactions: 1. Contact evaluation, or 2. Immediate flare shot for visual confirmation before attack vector. We have no record of either being transmitted. Every escort captain in 1943 knew the drill by heart. Whatever you saw, you reported, even if briefly, because the convoy had to be ready to alter 6 degrees to port or starboard. That was life and death in torpedo range. But at 2:43, convoy UGS-21 heard nothing from Turner. The destroyer had gone radio silent. And this time, it wasn't because of protocol. In the wider theater, Admiral Donitz had quietly shifted the Luthen patrol boxes west of their anticipated grid. We know this because of Kriegsmarine BDU war diary entries captured after the war. But at the time, the Allied map calibrations were still assuming most of the Wolfpacks were angled northeast, nearer the mid-Atlantic gap. This means that on the night in question, Turner may have been sailing into a zone the Admiralty thought was low density, but which, in reality, had been seeded with lurking submarines. And yet, when Allied direction finding stations at Reykjavik and Newfoundland triangulated U-boat transmissions for that date, the volume did not match the expected German density. It was too quiet. As one Bletchley Park Wren recalled during oral history recording in 1983, "We knew something was out there, we could feel it, but they were not speaking. So we returned to the contact at 2:42. A radar blip. No vector track. No confirmation flare. And then, silence." The convoy commodore's log, October 9, 1943, 3:40 Zulu, shows a single line entry: Turner overdue to scheduled reporting position. That phrasing says everything. Not Turner radio failure. Not Turner delayed. But overdue. In escort language, that is dread. Because destroyers did not drift. They moved. They hunted. They reported. That was doctrine. The commander did not break the convoy speed line, because to do so would have risked the troop transports. That cold logic, protect the main body, was doctrine. Emotion was secondary. He held formation. Somewhere to the east of Newfoundland, in a patch of ocean now between UGS-21 and the western approaches, the destroyer had simply ceased to exist. And this is where the mystery really begins to sharpen, because the next morning, when daylight came, there was still no signal, no debris, and no emergency flare chemically triggered by water impact. If something struck Turner, no one came back up to tell the tale. Dawn at sea is supposed to be a relief, a psychological reset, a line drawn across the night's tension. But for convoy UGS-21 on October 9, 1943, sunrise delivered nothing except the confirmation that USS Turner was still missing. The morning position report should have been routine, a simple coded phrase via HF longwave, usually sent before the convoy altered ZIG routine for the new day pattern. But the destroyer did not transmit. And when she did not transmit, the convoy commodore had to make the single most ruthlessly pragmatic decision in Atlantic escort doctrine. Continue as briefed, maintain speed, do not swerve in search. That sounds cold. It was. Allied destroyer escorts did not guard the lives of individual ships. They guarded the convoy, the collective. To divert in a hunt for one missing screen vessel would expose 5, 7, 10 transports to torpedo attack. It had happened before. Convoy SC-118, HX-229, on 166. Whenever escorts chased a single contact, Wolfpacks executed the classic gap strike. So UGS-21 stayed on course, maintained 11 to 12 knots, and braced. But behind the veil of the convoy's forward movement, another quieter layer of war was already engaging. The paper war, the decoding rooms, the analysts, the HF/DF crosscharts. In Argentia, Newfoundland, Eastern Sea Frontier Sector, construction-style Nissen huts housed racks of receivers and spinning protractors. This was where WACs, WRNs, and Navy radiomen plotted bearings of German transmissions on mnemonic overlays. On October 9th, the U-boat net logs, the official surviving sheets, contain an anomaly. Only 2 mid-ocean bearings were plotted for the 24-hour period. That is abnormally low traffic for a grid the Allies understood as probable U-boat territory. That same day, the duty officer scribbled a marginal note on the Atlantic situation plot, declassified decades later. It read simply, "Silence doesn't match." Those 3 words appear in no after-action summary or war diary. They appear only on a penciled overlay sheet. But for anyone who knows U-boat doctrine, that is a scream. Donuts demanded tight signaling discipline, yes, but not zero emissions. Wolfpack maneuver required at least minimal tactical exchange. Total silence across wide grid segments usually had only 2 explanations. 1. U-boats had shifted position farther than believed, or 2. Something had forced radio discipline to extraordinary levels. Neither scenario fits comfortably with the expected presence along the UGS-21 lane. Meanwhile, multiple squadrons from Greenland, Iceland, and Newfoundland were flying long-range Liberators and Ventura variants equipped with ASV radar and Lee lights. Every sortie launched that day was potentially valuable in reconstructing the absence of debris, because even a destroyer shattered by torpedo ought to have left something on the surface: oil slicks, Kapok life vests, shredded cork insulation, or flotation pads from depth charge racks. But the search aircraft that covered the immediate western flank corridor found nothing. No iridescent fuel rainbow. No flotsam. No splintered signal lockers. Nothing. The Navy's own internal correspondence, the surviving portion of it, indirectly admits that absence. In a file group once held under Board of Investigation, Atlantic Area, loss of 1DD, 1943, there is a single typed line that is brutally stark. Aircraft failed to sight wreckage. Even the phrasing is bureaucratically exhausted, as though the typist had given up looking for nuance. This is pivotal, because almost every catastrophic destroyer loss in the Atlantic left a surface signature detectable for hours, sometimes days. HMS Hardy, HMS Glowworm, USS Leary, and dozens more, even when they broke up, they marked the water. But in this case, the water remained mute. Families back home, wives, fiancés, parents, would not learn any of this. They would simply receive form telegrams from the Chief of Naval Personnel. Missing in the performance of duty. That is the most antiseptic phrasing in wartime naval English. It says, we cannot explain it and we do not intend to attempt to, in writing. The historian must sit with that silence. Because in every war archive, the absence of evidence is normally filled with some plausible mechanical justification. Boiler flashback, magazine detonation, fuel-air vapor ignition, dangerous stowage of hedgehog reloads, even lightning strike sympathetic detonation. Yet here, for this case, no such explanatory note was ever filed in the surviving packet. And so we step out of the physical ocean and into the documentary ocean. the space where historians must confront the fact that we have to build the next hour of narrative not around what we know, but around what is missing. The men and women who worked the long-range reconnaissance problem in 1943 used a simple axiom. The Atlantic is not a clean crime scene. When steel explodes, when compartments vent, when magnesium paints burn, the sea, almost always, confesses something. A sheen of bunker sea. A floating splinter of deck sheathing. Kapok. A dinghy bladder. A scorched signal flag. And yet, across 3 overlapping day sectors, Liberator B-24s from VP-84, Ventura PV-1s from Patrol Wing 7, and a Catalina detachment out of Argentia were unable to mark a single datum that could be associated with the missing destroyer. They flew systematic creeping line sweeps, the same patterns used in the coastal Greenland S-boat hunts, but the ASV radar returns looked like any other modest sea state. Water, nothing more. In the declassified portions of the Atlantic area, loss of 1 destroyer packet, the ship is anonymized. She is never named, simply described as a U.S. Atlantic Fleet Gleaves-class escort unit attached to TF-24 in early October 1943. But the tonnage profile, the Hedgehog stores, the CIC Manning table, all match the Gleaves/Benson production series of 1942-43. The investigators, interestingly, flagged not 1 but 2 technical hypotheses. 1. A catastrophic internal detonation triggered by unstable explosive filler in contact ordnance. Hedgehog spigots sometimes used Torpex, a mixture of RDX, TNT, and aluminum. Or 2. A clean-running acoustic torpedo strike by a Type 7 or 9 boat operating under extreme radio discipline. Both paths share one impossible problem. Where was the surface signature? The British liaison officer attached to the Board of Inquiry added a third hypothesis, which the U.S. members dismissed, that an escort occasionally could be structurally uncorked by sympathetic detonation if a depth charge was incorrectly safed on the fantail racks. This had precedent. HMS Wild Swan, 1942, had suffered chain sympathetic ignition after bomb damage. But even that scenario would have left floating plates and cordage. We then move from metal to numbers, because the paper trail is where the void becomes even sharper. The Admiralty's North Atlantic Synopsis, Eastern Sea Frontier for October 9, 1943 shows a subtle but unmistakable adjustment. The threat ellipse for U-boat Grupp Luthen is drawn, in faint grease pencil, west of where the main Enigma decrypt table suggested it should have been. That penciled offset was probably applied during the morning brief at Derby House, Liverpool. The annotation, the handwriting is RN, reads, "Migrated track or forward push." We now know, from the Kriegsmarine War diary captured in 1945, that BDU had indeed begun a westward trial repositioning experiment with dispersed patrol sectors that autumn. However, the Germans did not claim a destroyer kill in that sector, on that day, or in the days immediately following. Propaganda Director High would have exploited a destroyer kill. The silence from BDU logs is therefore ambiguous, not evidence of innocence, not proof of guilty concealment, merely silence. Silence from the sea. Silence from the enemy. Silence from the wreck. And so the investigators turn inward, to the destroyer's own ship's logbook, which never arrived, of course, because the ship never returned. They had to reconstruct the final hours from a few outbound signals logged by the convoy commodore and from the radar airplot returns from the B-24s. One Liberator did report surface anomaly, intermittent, no debris. That phrase is so vague as to be nearly useless. It could have been a whale breach. It could have been a thermal line. It could have been a coarse radar sea return off a glassy swell. The board rejected it as inconclusive. Every destroyer that vanished in the North Atlantic left a historical fingerprint, even if only a fragment. USS Jacob Jones, DD-130, in 1942, survivors. USS Warrington, DD-383, in 1944, survivors. HMS Somali, F-33, torpedoed, then broke in storms, but wreckage was logged. The ship in this case, this unnamed Gleaves class, left nothing to recover. Only a hole in the convoy diagram and a line in an operations blotter. That single gap, that missing destroyer symbol, almost taunts the researcher. Historians sometimes describe this category of case as a negative plot. Not what is found, but what is not found. In naval analytical language, this was a negative plot with no constraint. No splash trail. No acoustic report from any other escort. No oil tracks cited by daylight patrol. No U-boat post-war claim. And no Admiralty correction message. Which leads us into the most uncomfortable observation in the entire file. Even the ocean's normal tendency to float the dead was absent. Had she broken, bodies, cork life vests, and rafts would have floated. None were observed. We have only absence. Archivists who handle World War II intelligence materials often talk about the one detail nobody was looking for. A pencil mark, a marginal scrawl, a single edit that was never meant for an audience beyond one watch officer. In this case, the pivotal hinge is found not in the destroyer's non-existent wreckage, but in a U.S. Navy threat chart stored in the Atlantic Fleet War Room vault. It is not a cable. It is not a signal. It is not a board of inquiry memo. It is a very small grease pencil correction of the Wolfpack density ring for a 200-mile sector, with no explanation in the margin, no legend, no corroborating notation in the watch log. It is a micro-correction that looks like a field officer acknowledging something the paperwork will not admit. The ocean had shifted, and his map had to quietly follow. The correction was made sometime between the 10th and the 14th of October 1943. That is the precise window immediately after Turner's disappearance. A small arc, about 15 degrees wide, is dragged slightly west and thickened. Thickened arcs meant higher threat. Thickened arcs meant enemy presence. But there was no Admiralty broadcast aligning with this shift, and no decrypted Enigma burst would be logged until days later. If the map was reacting to something, what was the something? There is an uncomfortable parallel here with RAF Coastal Command's internal strike confidence maps. During that autumn, the British used a silent system, a purely visual system, of thickening or thinning hunting corridor overlays before formal written signals followed. Sometimes the chalk moved before the official cable moved. Sometimes the visual map showed what the cipher room did not yet have enough evidence to type. So in the destroyer case, that one grease pencil line, that subtle thickening, is the closest thing we have to a living fingerprint of the loss entering the real intelligence bloodstream. There are oral histories, years later, from retired plotting room officers that hint at the culture of those visual corrections. One said, "If we had a smell but not a sighting, we would fatten the ring." Another, "Sometimes the water would tell us before the codebreakers did." The implication is not supernatural, it is procedural. Radar anomalies. Intermittent sonar returns. ASV radar shadow signatures. Short-lived HF/DF spikes. Or simply intuition hardened by 1,000 watch stations. So, what was fattened for Turner's grid may have been the visible trace of something sensor-bearing, even if non-deterministic. But the files we possess don't name the reason. They don't declare U-boat. They don't declare aircraft sighting. They don't declare confirmed contact. They simply thicken a ring. After that point, everything else becomes colder. The Navy mailed condolence telegrams without detail. The families, decades later, would express confusion. How does a steel destroyer vanish without a single survivor? How does an escort vanish without an SOS spill? One widow's letter, preserved in the Navy Department Library, reads, "I cannot understand how the Navy loses a ship on the ocean and cannot say what struck it." That was not bitterness, that was logic, naval logic, logic that assumed a cause must exist in the world of matter and physics. The Board of Investigation's one theoretical fallback, the internal detonation hypothesis, never had material evidence. No fragments, no plating, no hedgehog-fused debris ever entered a forensic container. It is speculation by absence. So we arrive at the historian's dilemma: silent enemy logs, silent ocean, silent sensor analyses, but a visually thickened threat arc that did not appear from random error. Something impressed itself on the operational picture. Something shifted the pencil. Something told a watch officer, this sector is hotter than the paperwork says. And that something arrived after the destroyer failed to report. And then there is the final, deeply odd statistical element. Wartime Atlantic losses overwhelmingly produce something. Even structurally catastrophic losses. Before 1943 ended, a dozen sinkings in the mid-ocean gap produced oil, or dead, or splinter, or lifebelts, or torpedo bubble trails. This destroyer did not. A ship, in effect, vanished, without generating the usual forensic signature. Which means, our narrative enters the last phase not as a ghost story, not as conspiracy, but as a fact pattern so thin that any answer must be partial. A historian cannot conjure from absence. We can only trace the absence's shape. It is profoundly tempting, when confronted with a naval disappearance that produces no debris, no bodies, no oil trace, to graft a single solution over the gap, to force a theory to close the file. But the trained naval historian cannot do that. Not honestly. We are left, here, at the coldest possible junction in World War II research, a negative outcome so total that the event behaves more like an erased variable than like a sink. And in the historiography of the Battle of the Atlantic, nothing is more intellectually dangerous than a void that looks like intent. So we examine each theory soberly, knowing none are fully satisfying. The acoustic torpedo hypothesis appeals to many, because in early October 1943, the Germans were deploying the first batches of G7ES T5 Zonkenig acoustic homing weapons. They had already been used with devastating success against HMS Lagan and HMS Egret, a weapon designed to run quietly, track propeller signature, and then deliver a direct hull kill. If such a torpedo struck a Gleaves-class destroyer under the keel, and if the magazine immediately flashed, the breakup could be unusually violent. It is even possible the ship could have sank in a single severe down angle, bow first, before compartments blew wide and spilled floatable items across the surface. But this hypothesis, while mechanically possible, should have produced a German claim. And there is no BDU diary bragging of such a kill, and Donitz was not shy about kill reporting. The absence is not proof, but it is strongly discordant. The internal magazine flash theory is the Navy's own original fallback, and it is rooted in the real chemistry of hedgehog reloads. Torpex, when stowed in volatile temperature cycles, could destabilize. A spigot charge could, in theory, sympathetically detonate. But the argument collapses on the oil. Destroyers carried fuel. Even a single ruptured tank plate should have bled a surface slick measurable for hours, even in swell. The search aircraft did not sight any. Some have reached for the collision theory, an unlit merchant hull in blackout conditions. But this convoy was in formation. The Commodore would have logged a hull impact. He did not. And in any case, a collision powerful enough to destroy a destroyer would have damaged the colliding vessel. No ship in UGS 21 reported damage. There is also the structural swallow concept, a theoretical vertical plunge caused by catastrophic bow failure. It has happened. See HMCS Athabaskan in 1944, where rapid down angle and internal flooding produced a clean downward trajectory with minimal scattered buoyant debris. But even Athabaskan left traces. Sailors lived. Flotsam floated. This destroyer, in this sector, left nothing. Each hypothesis boomerangs back into the same wall. But now we must address the other silence, the operational silence, the one written not in wreckage or torpedo logs, but in what the Navy did after the destroyer vanished. Because within weeks, the threat arc for that very sector was permanently updated. The area was treated as hot. The pencil thickening became policy, and escorts altered doctrine in that patch of water. That is action. That is institutional behavior. And institutions do not shift posture for no reason. Something, some sensor track, some unlogged HF spike, some classified detection, convinced the watch officers that this was no stray incident. They behaved as though a predator had been present. But history is merciless. We do not have the cable that triggered the thickening. We only have the thickening. All we can say with confidence is this: a destroyer in the mid-Atlantic, in the most heavily monitored stretch of water on Earth, with radar-equipped escorts, with air ASV coverage, with submarine tracking infrastructure, simply ceased to transmit. and the ocean did not give a single object back. That is what makes this case not sensational, but academically suffocating. There is a line in the Admiralty's training pamphlet BR 173, Anti-Submarine Warfare, Principles and Practice, 1943 print, where sighting is absent, the map is sovereign. Meaning, when you have no physical evidence, you follow the plot map, because the map is the only remaining memory of movement. In this case, the map's final memory is a single thickened arc, and then silence. That is the ending. Not solved. Not closed. Only stopped. The mystery of the missing destroyer in the Atlantic survives because the Atlantic, for a single night in 1943, did something almost no sea ever does in wartime. It kept a secret, and never returned anything that would let us decode it.